Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrive by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 219, we sit down with Richard Gluckman, architect, designer, and one of the most influential figures in the world of exhibition and museum architecture. For more than 4 decades, Richard has shaped the way we experience art, creating spaces where the building itself quietly elevates the work it holds. From DIA to the Warhol Museum to landmark galleries across the globe, his projects reflect a deep respect for material, light, and space. In our conversation, Richard talks about his roots, from his upbringing and early pull towards architecture to his formative years at Syracuse University and the founding of what became Gluckman Tang Architects. We explore how he developed his reputation as an artist-architect, what it means to collaborate creatively with artists and curators, and how he's balanced a global practice with enduring commitment to place. That commitment especially evident here on the North Fork, where Richard has lived for more than 40 years. He shares what first brought him out east, how he approached designing his own home, and how the landscape, community, and even the change in seasons have shaped his relationship to the region. We also talk about his involvement with local institutions like the Oyster Ponds Historical Society, the impact of climate change on the area, and what thoughtful architecture can contribute to a rural coastal community. Finally, Richard reflects on the projects that continue to resonate with him and offers his hopes for the future of the North Fork as it grows and changes. So I hope you enjoy episode 219 with Richard Gluckman. This episode was recorded August 18th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really great to have you on today.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And so with these interviews, I usually like to start off, if you can give us a little background about yourself, tell us about your family roots and where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, a city of Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and H.H. Richardson, and then, of course, the Saarinen as well. But probably a greater influence on me as a boy was being driven by my father, occasionally by my grandfather, usually on a Sunday morning, through the post-industrial landscape in Buffalo, train depots, shipping berths, and of course the ubiquitous grain elevators. Rainer Banham, an architectural historian, wrote a book in the 80s called Concrete Atlantis, which he wrote in Buffalo, and it influenced my approach to our first significant project in the late 80s, the DIA Center for the Arts. My grandfather, who was trained as an engineer, taught me how to draw and used hand tools. And when I was about 9, my father used the word architect. I asked him what it was. He told me an architect was someone who made buildings, and that was that. I was fortunate to have my objective, anyway, laid out for me when I was young. So basically, that's my foundation myth.
And could you talk about just growing up? That was in Buffalo, just growing up there, what activities you would do as a child? Or
Well, I was a typical kid. We grew up on the edge of the city, Boy Scouts, Little League. But as I got a little older, 13, 14, my mother was a docent at the Albright Knox. I started taking art classes there on weekends. And then as I got older, high school, college years, coming back to Buffalo on vacations, I spent a lot of time in the Albright Knox, mainly in the contemporary areas of the bunshaft wing. And to this day, I think that, well, not to this day, up until about 5 years ago, I believe that the original green building, designed in 1905, I believe, and the Gordon Bunshaft addition to the Albright Knox it's one of the great binary compositions of an architectural project in the world. Bunshaft immediately respected the architecture scale and the datum of the original green building. However, it was a perverse solution, beautiful architecturally in terms of planning, but he put probably the most elegant auditorium in a glass box on top of the exhibition wing. Of course, an auditorium with lectures, movies, concerts needed a curtain around it, so he inverted the general idea of function following form, or form following function. And the plinth was the contemporary exhibition galleries. Of course, no natural light, low ceilinged, but architecturally resonant with the entire complex. So one of my favorite buildings in the world, but a kind of a perverse solution. I'm not going to get deeply into it, but I think the addition to the Albright Knox that's been completed recently, which I saw a couple of months ago, is an appalling conglomeration that is, I think, an insult to the Albright Knox, to the original Albright Knox, but I won't get too far in.
Yes.
At any rate, growing up in Buffalo was great. I had, to me, the snow, the climate, and everything else was normal. So everywhere else I've ever lived has been easier than that.
Yes.
And but I had a wonderful childhood, and part of it, which I'll get into here, is when I was a kid, 12 or so. My mother's favorite aunt had still has a wonderful house in Southold, and we would come down to Southold over this for a week or so every summer. Wow. But I also got to go north into Canada and, went up to camp in Algonquin Park and up in Temagami region. And my father was born in Toronto. And so a lot of my summer was also oriented to the north, which was also a great relationship too.
Yes. And just coming out of high school, did you know you wanted to go into architecture?
Well, no, I knew it even in high school. I started in the 9th or 10th grade taking mechanical drawing courses. I finished the art courses, but I went away to boarding school for a couple of years in Massachusetts. That was also influential in terms of understanding different environments outside of Buffalo and how importantly historic old towns in Massachusetts were to contemporary thinking. So that was a great experience. But by the time I went to college, I was always set on it. I always liked to draw, and I had taken a couple of courses.
And you studied architecture at Syracuse University. Were there any mentors or pivotal moments during that time that shaped your design philosophy?
Yeah, but first, your other question was what led me to go to Syracuse University.
Oh, yes.
I went to Syracuse University because I didn't get into Cornell. but Syracuse turned out great. I had 3 or 4 really wonderful teachers there, and second-generation modernists. One of them was exceptional, and ironically, he was teaching at Cornell at the time. And for 1 year, I went and worked for him at his studio in Cortland, about 30 miles south of Syracuse, and worked on some amazing projects that were built. One was what was called the Typewriter Housing Project in Ithaca, which is still a great example. And I'd go down a couple of days a week and sometimes stay well into the evenings. And if the office wasn't too busy, I'd be the only one there. And after dinner, he'd come in and he'd sit down and lecture to me about Korb and Wright. He was very close friends with an important historian at Cornell, whose name is escaping me. But that was a real extra bonus. And my teacher, one teacher in particular was a brilliant design teacher, and he was a very strong influence on all of us, Bill Scarborough. And he was a terrifically patient, intelligent, and evocative. At Syracuse, I met Fred Stell. We were sort of like-minded. He still has a practice on the South Fork, a very successful practice. We started our first firm a few years later. But the other factor of having mentors was my incredibly supportive parents. So while I was a student, a second-year student, they allowed me to design and then build their house in the Glenwood Hills south of Buffalo. I did it under the supervision of an architect and a contractor, and a couple of friends of mine from school helped me that first year. And after that, I built on my own, one with another guy who's a couple of years behind me at Syracuse. We built a camp for his brother-in-law up in the Adirondacks. And that was followed by a cottage for another classmate and his wife opposite Bayport on Fire Island. Okay. And I worked there for 2 summers, renovating and adding on to one of these 1950 cottages. And that was really a wonderful experience because it was so remote. And being on Fire Island in the fall, in September, October, was just spectacular. It was in the flyway. Water was great. The place was empty, and it was a fantastic experience.
Yes. And did you first arrive in New York City in the 1970s? Was that?
Yes. I had, after graduation and after those houses, I went to Boston and worked in Boston for 3 years for a very wonderful firm, doing a range of projects, new buildings and renovations. And then, mid-70s, the energy crisis came along and things slowed down. And one of the clients, a Swedish guy who was building the first public squash court in Massachusetts, which never got built, and it took a year or two of struggling and reducing it from 12 to 10 to 4 courts, asked me if I would help him sail his boat from Sweden to Cape Town. Seeing the writing on the wall with regard to the future of the practice in Boston at that time, I immediately said yes. So he sent me to, I went to the Cambridge School of Adult Education to learn celestial navigation, and I went down to the Coast Guard station on the waterfront in Boston and learned what I could learn there, and met him in Scotland in July of 75. And he and I sailed his 30-foot boat from Scotland to Cape Town over 3 months.
Wow.
And neither of us had sailed offshore before. Mm-hmm. I had sailed dinghies, but didn't navigate, but we found it. And then I hitchhiked around southern Africa lived in Cape Town for 3 months. And then I joined a South African crew on a small boat in the 1976 Cape to Rio race. So that took another month, got me to Rio, and I spent a couple of months in South America traveling around.
Okay.
And then coming to New York.
Coming to New York. Oh, you were working in Boston.
Worked in Boston, sailed to Cape Town, sailed to South America, and then came to New York to partner with Fred in spring of 1976. We were both doing design build. The first year I was here, I design built a house in New Jersey, and Fred was working on a house for his parents in Mount Kisco. So we lived in his loft down in Tribeca and worked out of the loft. And he had left he had left Edward Larrabee Barnes's office after 4 or 5 years working for Barnes, which led to a serendipitous encounter with my first project in New York City. Barnes was the architect for Mercer Street dance facility that was then purchased by Heiner Friedrich and Philippa de Menil, the founders of the Dia Art Foundation. They knew Fred was leaving Barnes's office. Fred said he had a new partner. He was busy with his parents' house, introduced me to Heiner and Phipp, and I ended up designing their townhouse at 7 East 82nd Street, 1977, my first project in New York City. That was an incredibly great event. It was my introduction to site-specific minimalist art, whose work we installed in the house and in many Dia buildings and sites following that. Andy Warhol, Walter de Maria, Don Judd, Cy Twombly, and in particular Dan Flavin, whose site-specific installations in the original house at 7 East 82nd Street had an incredibly powerful impact on my understanding of art, but also my understanding of how art can interact with architecture. And Flavin and Friedrich were, intentionally or not, terrific mentors. It was really part of my postgraduate education. We oversaw a series of installations of all those artists at 393 West Broadway, where the Broken Kilometer still is today. But it really taught me about the importance of the relationship between, because it was site-specific, and its relationship to the architecture. And that set the trajectory of my career.
And I was just curious what you, even being in New York during the 70s, what you thought of the city. And you mentioned the artistic community, but even the other, did it influence your architectural aspects of your?
Well, it did almost by necessity. In New York, and I arrived in March of 76. It was a centennial. That was when somebody who was it, Gerald Ford said, drop dead in New York at that point. That was an absolute low point. Crime was at its height. The city was filthy, but the city was undeveloped throughout the city, the way we know it. It's evolved. I think 76, and it seemed to me the centennial almost was the initiator of it, but it wasn't. But that's when New York began to turn around. And of course, I was really lucky. Fred and a few other architects 5 years before had bought a building on Harrison Street in Tribeca, a 5-story building for $60,000. And so I came along, moved in 1976, and the neighborhood was becoming populated with artists, Soho and Tribeca, and architects and dancers and others moving into these warehouse structures. So I do remember specifically an article, maybe in the late 70s in New York Magazine, that said basically zip code is no longer critical in New York to be in a hip neighborhood. And he was talking about Soho or Tribeca. And even though there were very few facilities for shopping and entertainment or restaurants, we were close enough to everywhere else. And it was a bit of a frontier, but it was all sweat equity. There was a real sense of community there among the people that lived there, whether they knew each other or not. And it was becoming this vibrant center of thinking and art and architecture. And, even Koch said when they were debating problems with developing the Bronx in the early 80s, he said, let's send the artists to the Bronx, and that'll fix everything. and it began to happen, and it continues to happen slowly, because as we know, I certainly couldn't afford Tribeca today.
Yes.
I've been lucky that I've been there for so long. The context hasn't changed, but the demographics certainly has. So, and the Yankees, I think, won the World Series about then, and it was even the Mets won the World Series in that period. So it was kind of an optimistic, for me, an optimistic experience coming to the city. I loved Boston, but New York was really dynamic.
Yes, definitely. And in the late 70s, you founded what would become Gluckman Tang Architects.
No, that wasn't. That was Gluckman Tang was much later. Gluckman lasted until the early mid-'80s. Fred moved out to the South Fork, and started his own practice out there, and has done an extremely successful practice there. We're still great friends. Probably he's my oldest friend. We do a lot of sailing together and get together a lot. But then I was on my own for several years, and things were picking up. Another thing about the economics of New York, even though the 76 was an economic low, whenever there was a small recession in the United States or in New York, at my scale, at the scale I was working, was recession-proof. So we had clients that were buying into New York City real estate, whether they were residential clients or beginning to do galleries in the 1980s. So we did David's Cookie Store. So we had work through some rough economic times in the 80s and into the 90s. But the firm was Richard Gluckman Architects for several years, and then I elevated one of my business associates, and it became Gluckman Manor, and then eventually, maybe 10 years ago, I'd had this fantastic employee who I'd poached out of another architect's office, and she was clearly partner material. Raised the professional profile of the office, within the office, and I begged her for 5 years to become a partner. Finally, she agreed about 10 years ago, and it's now Gluckman Tang Architects.
But in terms of the clients over the years, has that changed? Or because I know you've become known for creating spaces that respect and elevate the art they hold, whether at the Dia or the Warhol Museum. Was that something that evolved over time? Because you mentioned the Dia earlier.
It did. The first project was for the founders of Dia, and then that led to, we worked for Dia for 19 years, but that led to basically, and this was after Heiner left, the building that put us on the map was the Dia Art Foundation in 1985. At 548 West 22nd Street. And when that opened, so did the floodgates open. I didn't know it at the time, but when the Warhol Museum was founded, the three founding institutions, the Warhol Estate, the Dia, and the Carnegie, I didn't know it until much later that I was written into the contract that I was to be the architect of whatever the project was to be. So I wish I'd known it then. I could have negotiated for a tougher contract. But that led to, Dia led to numerous public and private commissions for galleries, museums, artist studios, and homes. And that has become what we're mainly known for, although the practice has included a lot of other things. Back in the 70s, I had a friend from Boston who introduced me to a young guy, and we did a subsidized housing project for the elderly in Middletown, Connecticut, a ground-up building that was very successful. The same guy, we had three other projects, HUD subsidized housing projects on the boards, 2 in Albany and a second one in Middletown. And then Ronald Reagan got elected, and HUD was gutted, and that was the end of our public housing story. We've always done residences. Early 70s, we did a couple of office buildings. one built, a couple designed, for one of our mentor firms that Fred had worked with. So we practice always has had some other parts to it, but the art-related projects were dominant, and they took. We had plenty of them. We never intended to grow a big office. We wanted to be in control of what we could be in control of. But eventually, we did start doing academic buildings, which are great clients, and we did a couple of big projects in Syracuse for the university, one a law school, ground up building, and projects at Drexel and Vassar and University of Georgia and University Museum in China.
Yes.
It was wonderful. So, and now we're working in hospitality, doing hospitality spas, and we're still doing art-related projects.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But many have described you as an artist architect. What does that mean to you, and how do you approach working with artists or curators?
Well, that's really been fun and really important. I think that going back to the 70s, at the time that I was doing these DA installations, I met Tiffany Bell, who was working for Dan Flavin at the time. And she introduced me into a whole new world, and that is the world of Renaissance and Baroque art. She was an art historian. On several trips to Italy back in the early 80s, she introduced me to the work, a series of 14th century to 16th, 17th century chapels with the work of Giotto to Caravaggio, in particular the Syracuse Chapel in Rome, which is another touchstone for me, and which there are two site-specific paintings by Caravaggio, the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul, facing each other across the altar. And she explained to me, standing in the chapel, how the viewer is drawn into the space of the paintings within the space of the chapel, one and the same. And this resonated with my experience helping Dan Flavin do his spectacular site-specific installation at 393 West Broadway a couple of years before. I often created a diptych of an image of the Caravaggio paintings and the Flavin at 393 to compare their approach to the relationship of the viewer to the art object, to the space they occupy, which has become our mantra, the fundamental tenet of all our work, is that balance between the intent of the project, the space of the project, and the relationship to the viewer. But with regard to all the other artists that we met and were introduced to, that was again part of my doctoral education. We learned from them how to experience art in space, and working for them, we understood the importance of reducing the visual noise of the space, all the appurtenances that are necessary for 20th, 21st century exhibition spaces, the mechanical equipment, lights, exit signs, extraneous detail. We knew that we had to create well-proportioned, well-detailed, and well-lit galleries, whether it was natural light, which we favor, or artificial light. And I asked somebody this once. I asked an architectural historian how to describe our work, and he said, well, we make frames for art, and we're happy to do that. So the artists, curators, and directors trusted me not to screw it up, whether it was a museum, a gallery, or their studios. Mm-hmm. But there was a twist that came along. I mean, this was great, and it was fun, and we did it well. But then in the early 90s, I began working with Richard Serra, or more accurately, starting work for the gallerists who were attracting Richard Serra. So I was designing a museum more accurately, he used to say, we design spaces in anticipation of Serra's work. And that's with regard to structural capacity, accessibility of getting the work in and out, and its size. So site specificity, on his case, went to another level. But then I learned, by seeing it, anticipating it, and designing spaces for it and watching it go in, that his work was a response to the architectural space, and his work included the complete integration of the art and the architecture. So that kind of flipped it for me. And from Sarah, I learned that the void is just as important as the solid form. So, and that affects how I think about space.
Yes.
So but that's been he's been a great influence.
But when you started designing spaces all over the world, how do you balance the global practice with staying grounded in the place? And has that relationship to place evolved for you over time?
I think that's a really good question. And it depends on a lot of things. It depends on location, and when you say the place, it's site, location, but it also depends on the type of art and type of culture that we're encountering. So context has always been a critical part of our approach to design, regardless of what the project is. Context, the site, and content, the program, is the equation that generates a concept. And the context is not just the site or the neighborhood buildings. It's about climate, culture, both historic and contemporary. It's about geography. It's about construction typologies, whether they're historic models that we're looking at, or the need for cutting-edge technologies, mainly in regard to materials and sustainability engineering strategies. So there sometimes has been an example over the last 20 years, as Western architects get invited into non-Western environments, to bring either one of two approaches. One, to try to do a contextual building that responds to local architecture and culture, or two, to bring in a spectacle device that is an object that sits on a space. In some ways, both are valid. I don't know. I think our approach has always been the second one, to try to bring in a textual building into that respects either the contemporary or historic culture and architecture of the space. But both are valid, and I think that I'll give examples of that, limited examples of that. But I think most architects these days are sensitive to the historic references. But what's happening in the world today, and it's not just about art, but new developments around the world create their own contexts, for better or worse. The population growth, economic parameters, natural resources, but new spheres of interest are demanding it. Examples like new cities in East Asia, South Asia, Africa, even in the United States and Europe, but most apparent in the developing economies in the world today. But they're spectacular, and in some cases they're valid, and when they're done, they can be done incredibly well. I think Doha is an example, Qatar is an example, but it's not all sustainable, and it's a concern as to how this is going to evolve. In the literal and figurative climate, economic and natural climate and world, and the resources in the world today, and how this is going to move forward over the next 20 or 50 years. So it's a complex and in some cases worrying situation. Globalization has been good for a lot of people and countries, but it's one wishes that it could be modulated a little bit better.
Yes, definitely. And I wanted to just switch a little bit to the North Fork, because you had mentioned the North Fork that you would visit even as a child growing up here, but you've lived on the North Fork for over 4 decades. What first brought you out here later on in
Well,
life?
when I moved to New York, my parents would want to come north from Florida in the summers, and they would for a couple of months, and we rented the same barn that we used to stay in on my aunt's property in Southold. It was it was sort of a built in probably the beginning of the 20th century as a garage with a little apartment next to it for the chauffeur. But upstairs in the garage was a professional-sized billiard table. The building had to have been built around the table. It practically filled the upstairs, which is just lined with windows and benches. It was a wonder. It's still there. The billiard table isn't, but the house is still there. Anyway, we rented it for years. And this was when I was still up until my 20s, and I'd come back from come to New York, late 20s, bought a small racing sailboat, and had a lot of young cousins at my aunt's house. She's my great aunt. And I would race the boat mainly in Gardner's Bay. And I would exploit my younger cousins and their friends to go with me and sail. And after they'd been with me once on a 12-hour day, they would disappear forever. So I had to search for crew. So I ended up in Orient on the wharf, picking up a couple of young guys, 15 years old, and they became my main crew for the next several years. But gradually, I guess maybe because I became a better sailor, but then one of their grandfathers back then gave me the opportunity to buy a house in Orient. And since my aunt's house was getting filled up, they're still having kids and they needed more space, I needed to find another place to live. And so that all coincided just before I got married in 83, 84. So I bought a house on the main road in Orient and found plenty of crew out there. So that's what got me to Orient.
Okay.
That was fortunate.
And at that time, what did you think of the area or Orient, and was it more quiet at that time?
Oh, Orient was great. Yeah, it was far fewer summer or outsiders, New Yorkers, than the demographics changed a lot. And it was Orient, Greenport, those areas back then. Maybe I'm going back a little further. Clearly an active agricultural community, but when I first came out, there was an active fishing community. But when I arrived in the 80s, the fishing community was much smaller. Agriculture was shrinking, but it was incredibly lovely. Orient in particular was and still is a special place. And I think the causeway has a lot to do with it. And also the fact that they have been aware of land preservation for a long time. So and it's also a smaller geographic area. So there's not a lot of, and they're active farmers there still. So there's not a lot of land available. So the development there, I think, has been slowed down. Its distance may be a factor. So it's the visual sort of impact of Orient has changed much less, I think, than many other places on the North Fork, but it's clearly way more than the South Fork. So it's retained that sort of unique characteristic of predominantly open land, whether it's farmed or not, but a lot of it is now being preserved. And I think that's one of the reasons it still makes it special, even though there's slow, gradual, and fairly contained development out there.
Yes, definitely. And your own home on the North Fork is notable in itself. How did you approach designing it as an architect for yourself?
That was good. Well, that house was clearly a response to the context. It's in a wetland, basically it's in a swamp. 6 feet above sea level. There's FEMA requirements. I did by then understand things like prevailing wind and solar orientation. So that was a factor in the way it was sited. But another factor in the way it was sited and built was I had a neighbor to the north, and I had an approved house to the south. So the house was sort of took that into consideration. It had to be elevated. Mm-hmm. The septic tank had to be out of the water table. So a lot of the parameters were defined by those existing conditions. Mm-hmm. However, I was also the reason I picked that site was because we were on the main road. I had 2 young children, mm-hmm. and I didn't want to be on the main road. I didn't want to be in the village of Orient because I would be constrained to historic
requirements.
Not requirements then, but just the sensitivity to the to the existing village neighborhood. And I had enough urban life in mm-hmm. New York, so I wanted a much more rural life. And so I was really lucky to get this piece of property. It was mostly surrounded by state land mm-hmm. And open land, except for the site to the south. So it worked out really well in that regard. But I did have some outside influences mm-hmm. on the design of the building. And one was Villa Imo in the Veneto, designed in the 16th century by Andrea Palladio, one of his great rural estates. And another was Casa Malaparte, designed by Enrique Malaparte off the coast of Capri. And if you look at the pictures of those two, you'll see the direct influences mm-hmm. on the house. And the third, I was always influenced by Corbusier's work, so there's a certain aspect to that work on the house. So those three elements, all those elements, orientation, views, elevation, and some design influence from the 17th and 20th centuries impacted the design of that house, and I'm pretty happy with it.
Yes. And
I've been baby-proofing it for the last 4 months, so now it's legal.
Okay.
The railings are down, the stairs is secured right, and so it's now finally legal. I hope. I hope my friends at the building department don't hear this.
No, but you've spoken about the environmental and seasonal changes on the North Fork, particularly in connection to things like ice boating. How has climate change affected the character of the place you've called home for so long?
I think it was over 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. When I was in the old house, sunny, cold December day. I walk with my daughters, they were about probably 5 and 7 or 8, over snow-covered fields all the way over to Halleck's Bay. From our house on the main road. And arriving there at the little landing there, it was like a Currier and Ives print. Mm. There were people in 19th century ice boats. There were 20th century ice boats. There were dogs running around on the ice. There were kids playing hockey. Linton Dooley was cooking hot dogs for anybody and everybody on the side of the ice. And it was an amazing environment. And I didn't know anybody then. We pretty much just arrived. And but it was just a wonderful situation. But it never occurred to me then that I could do an ice boat. I didn't know what an ice boat was or did. But it wasn't until maybe 8 or 9 years later, it happened again. It froze again. And by then I knew some people. I helped Bobby Sorensen put together Platter, his 19th century gaff-rigged ice boat, spending all day on the ice one day, and the next day getting to sail it, which was just great fun. Mm. Mike Acebo, who's a major, he ran Brewers, took me out in his J14 ice boat. Fortunately, it had a sidecar, and that was it. I was hooked. I couldn't believe it. And as we all knew then, that over the last 100 years, Halleck's Bay freezes on average once every 7 years. So I was 63. I remember talking to my wife on the phone, telling her I wanted to buy an ice boat. And she said, why would I want to buy something that I might not get to use until I'm 70? But I did anyway. And so for the past 15 years, I've just had a fantastic time sailing up in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine. I call it my midlife crisis resolution solution. And I don't understand why more people don't do it. It's so much fun. But finally, this past year, I've aged out of racing my DN. So, it's probably going to be at the Maritime Festival.
Okay. This fall.
Yeah, and it's on the market.
Okay.
If anybody out there is interested.
Yes. And then you've also been involved with Oyster Pond's Historical Society and other cultural organizations. Why is it important for you to support local institutions?
It's great. It's institutions like OHS, Pocatuck Hall, the fire department, the yacht club, Lathan's farm stand, the local churches, the country store, Billy Hand's, and of course the Floyd Bennett Library, all contribute to the identity, the cultural history, and the scale and quality of life out here. So you give what you get, and it's been great dealing with all of them and getting the incredibly rich quality of life that they all provide.
Yes.
It's a pretty great place, even without a drawbridge on the causeway.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, what do you think good architecture can contribute to a rural or coastal community like ours?
Well, good architecture can contribute to any community, urban, rural, anywhere in the world, because good architects are responsible, or should be responsible, the cultural context and the historic buildings, the history, be responsible to scale, texture, and materiality. There's a lot of good architects out here doing really good contemporary architecture, using these principles and designing good contemporary buildings that are good neighbors to their contemporary examples of good neighbors to their colonial the colonial context. But a lot of it has to do with sustainability now, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. And I also think planning and zoning and land preservation is even more critical to the context of the North Fork. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end here.
Okay. But just looking back at your career, are there any particular projects, large or small, that continue to resonate with you personally?
Yes. I have a short list. Yeah, we call it our legacy project. But the DIA is probably one of the top three. 1985. It set a new model for exhibition space and for interventions into historic structures. Jump-started my career. It led to many projects of which we're known for, like Warhol and others. But the Helmut Lang store was a pretty iconic project that one of the reasons that it was successful was that I liked about it was the ambiguity of it. When people walked in, they didn't know whether it was an art installation or a retail store. And that was really interesting. And it got 2 major awards from Architectural Record. One for a successful business model and the other for a successful design model. And that was influenced directly by the work of David Smith and Richard Serra. but it was also had a great client. Helmut was it was an artist at heart, and was incredibly supportive of our thinking on that. And the Museo Picasso Malaga is probably the best contextual project we've ever done. It spanned almost 2,300 years of architectural history, the whole panoply of history of the Mediterranean within the building. But it was a matrix of old and new structures, of 7 or 8 structures in the historic quarter of Malaga. And it just had its 25th anniversary recently, and it's as good as and as important as it was when we first did it. What still resonates is we've just been working on a project for a couple of years, up to a year or two ago, the Palazzo del Lavoro in Turin, building designed in the 60s by Pierluigi Nervi, putting in a collection of mid-20th century, mostly American, site-specific minimalist artists. And this was we had a great time working on it. A fantastic project, but not built, and it won't be built by us. But incredibly disappointing. But I'm more mature now, and I'm really. It was a great experience to work on it. The process was great, and of course, my own house resonates daily. And what else resonates daily is whatever I'm working on. And right now, I'm working on a barn and a house in Orient, and that's keeping me busy right now.
But I was wondering, were there any future projects you're working on? Because I don't know if I read something in New York City by the Oculus, or is there like a snake?
Oh, that.
That was a little.
Oh, that was fantastic too. That was wonderful. Well, first of all, that was commissioned by a client here in Orient, whose house we've been renovating, and it was for celebrate the Year of the Snake, the Chinese New Year, and to be an object, a way to celebrate it by being placed in the Oculus at the World Trade Center. And so there was an artist involved with the conceptual sketch of the snake, a wonderful guy. And I have a fantastic employee who took that sketch and turned it into 140-foot long fabrication of using aluminum panels of a snake that was in the Oculus for only a month, which was really unfortunate that it didn't last longer. But of course, 7 years from now, there'll be another Year of the Snake. But this kid, one of the principals in my office, not converted the sketch into a buildable model, supervised the fabrication and the installation of this whole thing. He did the lion's share of the work on it, and it was a terrific project and pretty well received by the people that got to see it.
Yes.
I wish we could find a place for it. So that's another plug. We're looking for a place for this 40-foot wide by 140-foot snake.
Wow.
It comes apart and can go back together.
But I wanted to just ask a bit before we get to the final question. Just looking at spaces today and how society has changed, use and how people might interact with spaces. But you said architecture frames experience. What do you believe people most need from spaces today, whether it's quiet, connection, inspiration, or something else?
Look, I think, as I said earlier, it sounds like, the content constants. Content is what you're talking about, and that is the purpose of the space, whether it's an airport, a library, a home, a museum. The purpose of the space really ought to accommodate not just the parameters that describe the uses and its function, but also the relationship between the result of that effort and how people inhabit the space. And I think that we all know that there's some architecture that's just spectacle, and that it may or may not may be striking, it may be dynamic, it may be spectacular, but it also needs to be relate to the human scale. It needs to accommodate all kinds of conditions with regard to light, sound, and just physical movement or stasis through space. So all of those characteristics that start with the human's reaction to the space around it need to be appropriately accommodated by the architectural frame that contains the operation.
Yes.
So that's about a 10,000-year-old concept.
Yes.
There's a cave, or space station.
And like there are different time periods of different styles of architecture, but do you think today it's hard to put a name to what's going on today, like the minimalist periods or modernist periods? I think there's so much wide range of designs and architecture today. Do you see that evolving over time, or even just looking at architecture around the world?
Yeah. Again, this evolution still needs to be partly defined by context, whether it's the neighboring buildings, the climate, the culture, whether it's historic or contemporary, geography, construction typologies, whether it's going to be whether the historic context is important, or whether it's got to be cutting edge in terms of constructability, new materials, and all in service of sustainability, but also brand. I think branding is an overused word, and it means a lot of things, but impacts by corporations, countries, entities, governments to create a spectacle building or economically successful building is driving a lot of things that are going on in the world. I think most architects are sensitive to historic context or historic references all over the world, but in a lot of new far-flung locations, but even in established locations, whether it's Europe or the United States, new developments create their own contexts for better or worse. Population growth, economic parameters, natural resources, I think I just mentioned it, new spheres of interest are demanding sort of, again, new images, new visions, new scale, but not all of it is sustainable. So it's some of it's spectacular, places. But I compare places like Doha to Abu Dhabi, and Doha is far more successful. It seems more sustainable for various reasons. And those are two closely related, similar driving forces. So it's, what do they think global, act local? I've been privileged to see both sides of that. And you can apply the same principles, but hopefully you don't get the same results.
Yeah. And that's something that you see even here on the North Fork, looking ahead for the...
It's really, it's really important that everyone on the North Fork deal with this future. And I think, but like I said earlier, good town planning, zoning, land use, and dealing with more critical issues like water, climate change, but also jobs, housing, are more important. Those are the critical things facing us today. There's a real need for appropriate housing across the entire economic strata, mainly housing for people who work the farms, who maintain our lawns, work in hospitals, stores, businesses, all need to be able to live on the East End, not just work here. To say nothing of the needs that the volunteer fire departments are now faced with, guys, women that can afford to live near the communities that they're serving. Towns like Riverhead and Greenport, I believe, need greater density to accommodate this working class of people, as well as the increasing population of retired people who want to be able to walk or have easy access to stores and restaurants.
Yeah.
Good architecture is icing on the cake, but growing thoughtfully into the future is the real challenge.
Yes, definitely. I'm trying to think just with the North Fork and its community. You mentioned architecture is kind of, that's the icing on the cake, but do you think for communities out here, if they're struggling with money and they just need some type of housing, but then just looking at the design, it might, we've seen, I think, across the country, there's been, for materials, the prices have gone up. And I don't know if you would agree that some of the new mid-rise or 4 or 5 story housing buildings, they've not of the best quality, or maybe it's like a mishmash of materials that seems to be popular going on right now, just general.
Well, that's because so much of that is, both. There's two things. Mid-level commercial residential projects are development driven, as are high-end level, but high-end level development driven, in dense urban centers like New York or in remote places on resorts. The very high-end ones, the top 1%, are extremely well designed, extremely well built, and extremely expensive.
Yes.
Not necessarily sustainable. Let's take those off the table, because those cannot and probably will not be built on the North Fork. That's not a North Fork problem. The mid-level stuff, whether it's private residential, commercially developed residential housing, are developer-driven, and 99% of all developers, their main parameter is the bottom line and fulfilling what the last real estate section in the newspaper was selling at the right amount. Mm-hmm. They do not necessarily have the same interest at heart. Subsidized housing, which is not well funded but has greater responsibility, that development on the North Road is really well done. Mm-hmm. It's not a style that I subscribe to, but it's a really well done project. But it's in a slightly remote location. Mm-hmm. So, to answer your question, yes, there's so much junk being built all over the country of all levels, even some of them. So that's a qualitative issue. Quality should be appropriate to the budget, appropriate to the goals, but it also it finds its own level. But I think there's an obligation to do. It's not just the quality and design of the design or the construction of the building. It's where it is and who it serves. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think that when I started doing subsidized housing, when I was a student working for Seligman, that was a subsidized housing project. It's a fantastic project. Mm-hmm. And 25, 30 years later, it was renovated. It was rebooted, and it looks like a high-end project, but it wasn't. Mm-hmm. But it can be done, and it can be done both by a combination of private commercial entities. New York State Urban Development Corporation, when it was headed by Ed Logue in the 70s, was famous. They built Stony Brook. They built universities, fire stations, office buildings all over New York State. Mm-hmm. Very high quality design and very high quality construction, with the best architects practicing in the country. That model can be recreated. Yes. The operation of it, and this is where the disconnect happens, government administration of those projects was time-consuming, expensive, and inefficient. Mm-hmm. That if those two things can be combined, and they are in some parts of the world, and they can be done here, that can result in a win-win situation for the sponsors of the project, the users of the project, and the communities in which the projects are located. It's doable, but there's so much fear these days with corporations, with government, and with bankers that it's hard to break through that resistance. Yeah. But it can be done. And on a small scale on the North Fork, because it's a small scale, because the scale and the building constructability issues of the building, it's simple. These can be done by, good quality residential scale contractors. It's no more complicated. Doing a good housing project for, say, 30 or 40 units, whether it's 2 stories or 3 stories, I doubt zoning and would want, and I wouldn't on the North Fork, anything more than 3 stories. But that quality building can be done by a much wider range of builders than can do a 50-story tower. So that, and the materials are changing. They're becoming more efficient, more sustainable, and they some are local, some could be from Canada. But the use of the materials, the quality of construction, the energy regulations, the energy standards that are now driving a lot of projects, residential projects, they're all there. And they all will result in a higher quality building than we might have gotten 10 or 15 years ago. Yes. But it's up to the communities politically to locate them in the right place so they serve the right constituency. And the constituents are people that don't necessarily have 2 cars, or they want their kids to be able to go to a good school, or they want to be able to shop and go out, get entertainment at a fairly recent proximity, and have playgrounds and parks to play in. They want what everybody wants. But what everybody wants ought to be available to everybody. Yes. And it can be in this community. Yeah. But again, I think it has to do with increasing density in the main hubs, like Sag Harbor, Greenport, Riverhead, maybe others. And it's got to be jammed down our throats.
Yes, definitely. No, but I think we covered everything. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and all the work you've done over your career within the architectural field. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks. I've enjoyed both.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 219 with Richard Gluckman. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.